Hypotheticals are some of the coolest discussions we can have about history. What could have possibly been, and who could have beaten who? Especially when talking of the two largest empires this world has ever seen, and whose fighting styles could not have been more different. Join us as we discuss the hypothetical of the Romans versus the Mongols.
You're listening to History Unscripted with Gabriel and Carl.
All right, we are back for Pod 3, History with Gabriel and Carl. We want to thank all of our listeners here to tuning in for another history discussion. And today, I think we've got a really good one. I have loved this hypothetical since I got into history back when I was playing Age of Empires 2 in like 6th grade. The Mongols versus the Romans. Now, there's some caveats because yes, I know I've read this online. People talk about the Mongols with the gunpowder. People talk about the technological differences. That's not really what we're going to be talking about. We understand that the Mongol Empire versus the Roman Empire isn't a fair fight at all, right? 1400s Mongols versus 100s AD Romans is not a fair fight necessarily. But what we want to discuss is, let's say you drop Genghis Khan and his Mongol army in 120 Common Era when Rome is at its height. And Genghis Khan still wants to conquer. He still wants to do everything. And he just heads west first instead of east. And he runs into the Romans. That's, I think, where we want to frame our conversation. That's, to me, what's always been fascinating. Kind of the initial Mongol horde. How far would they make it against Rome? What do we think would happen in this historical hypothetical? So, for our listeners, how we're going to break this up. So, I think we're going to go with pros of the Romans. Why? And I'm going to take the Romans, and Carl will take mainly the Mongols. That doesn't mean we won't just both discuss both, of course, both empires or both armies. But I'm going to primarily focus on the Romans because playing Skyrim, I was always on the side of the empire. I hated whatever the rebellion was. I've always been an imperial guy. So I love Rome, anything that even resembles Rome in video games. And I'm going to go kind of pros and cons. Well, or we could do, what do you want? You want to do pros of Rome, pros of the Mongols, and then cons of both, and then go into more kind of the what if? What do you think?
I think we can just go straight shot. Keep
Okay.
the same thought rolling. You talk about the Romans, and then I can discuss Mongols, and then we can go from there.
Okay. And like obviously feel free to chime in. I mean, as we're discussing, feel free to chime in as we go if there's anything you want to add about the Romans. So let's go and start with pros of the Romans, or who are the Roman legions? Now, again, I'm not going to dive into Latin names. I'm not going to pretend to be this really there's so much written about the Romans. You really can be a Rome expert, truly, and I'm not that. So forgive me if I get some things wrong. This is going to be a broad stroke because, again, we try to keep this around 45 to an hour. And, man, you could go down some deep rabbit holes with the Romans and the Mongols. So, Roman legions, okay? Everybody, maybe not everybody, but a lot of people have this kind of that stereotypical view of a Roman legion. And to be honest with you, it's not that far off, okay? That's not like what our listeners probably are picturing with the Roman legions isn't that inaccurate. So I want to start with the recruits of the Roman legions. Now, the Roman legions evolve a lot from the Republic period to the Imperial period. They become a professional army under the consul Marius. And that, let me just double check on the time period there on when that happens, when Rome kind of becomes a volunteer, conscripted, as needed army to that more professional army. So I just want to get my years right on this. And so I know it was under General Marius in the Marian reforms. Around it's saying I'm finding about 107 before Common Era, but it wasn't fully finalized until Augustus in 13 before Common Era. So this time period that we're talking about, our hypothetical, is going to be about 100 years after Augustus. But again, Rome at this point is a professional army. And to be honest with you, I think that's going to be the best thing they have going for them against the Mongols. If I'm looking at this as what does Rome have to win it, I think their discipline and their professionalism is what would win the day. I'll be honest with you. I don't think the technology is that different. I don't think what Genghis Khan and his horde brought to the battlefield was that different than what Rome experienced. Now, for our hypothetical, Parthia, which was a very big enemy of Rome, they don't even exist. Okay, so the Parthian Empire that Rome battled kind of back and forth with, they don't even exist because we just have the Mongols being plopped down. But that I'll get to that a little later, why Parthia even matters. But let's kind of start with just the Roman legion. So when Rome becomes a professional force, Rome has really expanded who can actually join into the army. And they're going out and actively recruiting. Okay, and when you join the Roman army, you're going to get benefits. Sometimes it's land at the end of your service, which was about, I think, around 25 years. Other times it could be like a monetary amount. And so I think that's important because these Roman soldiers do have something to fight for. They aren't just peasants necessarily going to fight and go home. I mean, this is their job, and they have a retirement to look forward to if they complete their service. So that's going to be a huge motivator no matter who they're fighting, one. Now, the average Roman, it was 6 feet in Roman feet, which for us is about 5'7", 5'8", 5'9"-ish. So that's actually not super tiny, about maybe 150, 160, 175 pounds. So that's not like tiny, which kind of surprised me. I think you always like picture them like as like these 5'4", 5'5", like little Roman dudes against these giant like Gallic warriors, right? That are like 6 foot. But no, actually, the Roman soldiers weren't too shabby as far as historical standards go in their height and weight. Again, because they're probably fairly well fed. So the recruits are generally between, I'd say, 17 and maybe into their 40s, and they're actively recruited. And so when you get recruited into the Roman Legion at this point, you actually go through 4 months of training, which is a long time. And that's, again, that adds to the discipline and the professionalism of this army. I did not know that when I started my research. I was like, yes, obviously they were trained to be in the Legion. But I didn't realize how much training they did. 4 months. And a lot of the focus actually would have been on like swimming, jumping, and marching. So these were very physically fit warriors. They could march, I think it was like 30 miles in a day if they needed to, which, again, for foot soldiers is really, really impressive. And they could carry everything on their backs. In fact, you go back to the general or consul Marius with the Marian reforms, they call them Marius's mules because they would throw everything on their back and they could march. And again, when you're thinking of an infantry, that's very, very impressive. So one thing Rome has going for it is speed. You know, you imagine the Mongol hordes arrive at the doorstep of the Roman Empire in its east. From this, because again, at this point, Rome owns like Great Britain all the way to like Syria, Ukraine. If you kind of go north into Europe, it's like the Ukraine area. A huge chunk of land. So when the Mongols show up, the Rome's not necessarily going to have a lot of issues getting the legions there quickly. Now, is it quick enough? That's something we'll discuss. But yeah, so, you know, one misconception with the Romans is that a lot of that armor that you would see where it's like maybe like strip armor in a way and it's kind of like segmented, that actually wasn't super common. They probably just would have wore chainmail, which is effective against arrows, but I don't think that alone is going to block the Mongols. arrows. What might work and is a pro for the Romans is the fact that their shields, they were layered very tough wood, and when you layer wood right, it is incredibly durable. And so I actually do think the Roman shields could tank quite a bit of arrows. Now again, maybe you can kind of expand on how many arrows are Mongols carrying into battle. But I do think the Romans can definitely tank a bunch of Mongol arrows. So to me, that's a pro. I think the armor and the shield are definitely pro to the Roman. Is something that's going to benefit them. Now, a con is the fact that they're infantry. In infantry versus horse archers, I mean, you got to bet on the horse archers. You just do. That is going to be Rome's biggest. How are they going to deal with, the horse archers? Again, I don't think the Romans are going to be. They're not going to be tricked the way a lot of the medieval armies were, right? The Mongols run up, they act like they're retreating. These peasants that just want to go home, we won, and they start chasing after them, and the Mongols turn around, and it's just a slaughter. No, I don't think that's happening to Rome. Maybe the first battle that happens, and then the Romans are like, oh, okay, so this is something they do. So they write it down, and they start training their legions on it, right? They start training their troops. Don't fall for the feigned retreat. But again, I mean, you can't have Rome just sitting there in a Tostido, which is their tank formation with their shields up, because you can't go on the offense like that. So again, the gladius is a great sword, but that's not going to do well against the Mongols. That's almost useless. Even the pilum or the pilum that they could throw, very effective against infantry. The Mongols aren't going to let you do that. But again, here comes to another pro of the Roman, is their ability to build fortifications. I imagine maybe the Romans get beat a few times by the Mongols, but then the next time they realize we're just going to fortify, and they can then start bringing in their artillery. All right, and they had like the ballista and the onager, if I said that right. They actually have very effective artillery that can match the range of the Mongols. And so again, I think that's something they have going for them, is they can fortify up, start bringing in some artillery, because they have the trade lines, because they're a giant empire. They've got the trade route, they've got the roads. And so the Mongols show up maybe again for another battle or another raid, and next thing you know, they're shooting at them with these arrows. And so I think the ability to fortify is going to be a really big deal to stop the Mongols. But again, can they beat the Mongols in a battle in an open field? Probably not. I just don't think, even with their auxiliary troops, because the Romans had archers for auxiliary troops. They had Syrian archers. They had the Balearic slingers, right? But can they bring enough of them to the front to fight the Mongols? I don't know if they could, because they're going to need a buttload of archers. Because that is the way to beat the Mongols, is you got to have archers of your own that are disciplined and can fire and match the range of the Mongols. Now, one thing I did go down the rabbit hole was the Balearic slingers, and I did not realize how effective slingers were. Holy moly. I mean, hundreds and hundreds of yards they were effective. And so that might be Rome's X factor, is the Mongols, they're riding up, and next thing you know, they're getting pelted with lead, because the Romans and Greeks used lead slingshot, projectiles. That could be an X factor for the Romans. But is there anything else you want to know in this discussion, Carl, about the Romans? Again, this is a very broad, there's so much you could go into it, but again, we're trying to, keep this going as smoothly. Is there anything else that you would want to know about the Roman army when facing the Mongols?
Mostly just the Roman cavalry that they would counter with themselves.
Right. Okay. So Rome does have, they have auxiliary. So Rome has the upper class Romans they were generally the cavalry. Because a lot of times they'd have to supply their own horse and their own equipment for that. A lot of the legionary ground troops, infantry, again, because they were recruited from the poor, couldn't always supply. So the state actually would supply a lot of the legion, like the infantry, their supplies and their shield and stuff. But if you're a cavalry, that means you've got the money to supply probably your own horse, in that gear. So they did use auxiliary troops like Germanic cavalry, which were very effective, but they're not cavalry archers. So you can't beat the Mongols with cavalry, just like a cavalry guy with spear is going to get killed by the Mongols so fast. So as far as cavalry, they are lacking. But if I'm a Roman general or a centurion or whoever, I'm not necessarily thinking I'm going to beat the Mongols with cavalry, because you cannot beat the Mongols at their own game. Unless maybe you've got just heavily cataphract, like heavily armored. But the Romans didn't have that with their cavalry. Now, again, the Romans do. I want to talk a little bit about Parthia real fast, because you have the Parthian Empire, which is pretty big compared to the Roman Empire, and they're at their heights at the same time. And the Parthian actually wipe out a Roman army. I believe it was under Cassius. Anyways, and it was a humiliating defeat for the Romans, because the Parthian horse archers and their cavalry did decimate the Roman legions. However, if you look at the later battles between the Parthians and the Romans and the Parthians, actually, it ends up kind of just being a stalemate. And so that shows that Rome was able to counter the cavalry archers. Because the Parthian cavalry archers, maybe they're not Mongols, but they're very effective. So clearly Rome had tactics to deal with cavalry archers, because they could even keep the mighty Parthians at bay. So that's kind of the Romans, kind of the Roman perspective. Again, very quickly. So Carl, why don't you go ahead and give us what you would say for the Mongols is the pros and the cons, and kind of the overall view there.
So for the Mongols, pretty much the image that you have of them is by and large the correct image. If it is a Mongolian fighter, he's going to be on horseback and he's going to be shooting the composite bow. They did have foot soldiers, they did have infantry, but it was made primarily of conscripted, conquered nations. Same thing with their siege engineers. And so that's why the Mongols were able to use gunpowder in their time, because their siege engineers, they used the Chinese and the Persians. And in my research, it appeared that most of the time they used infantry as kind of a mop-up role. They went in with their horses and their arrows and they pelted the enemy, and then the infantry came in to kind of clean up the wounded, kill the enemy wounded. Well, I would say the biggest advantage that the Mongols have is their bow, is the composite bow. And interestingly enough, it is nowhere near a new technology, even at the time of the Mongols. There's depictions of a composite bow from pottery in Syria in 2000 BC. And so the Greeks and the Romans actually fought against people that used the composite bow, but they never adopted it themselves, which I can get into why in a little bit. But the composite bow is basically the sniper rifle of the medieval time period. There is according to Ottoman chroniclers, Sultan Selim III shot at an arrow from a composite bow 930 yards.
Oh my goodness.
Now, whether that is complete fact or not, the average, even today, built the same way that it would have been in the Mongols' time. The average effective range of this bow was 400 to 500 yards, with the capability of shooting up to 700. And
Man.
so it was an extremely impressive feat of technology for the time. And it was very painstaking to make, however.
Right.
And that was a really big drawback. One of them is that it took forever to make, because you layered a whole bunch of different materials together and you basically glued them together with boiled animal parts. And so in a dry, arid climate, It worked beautifully.
Hmm.
But moisture was its biggest weakness. And so if you look at a map of the Mongolian Empire, most of it is in dry, arid part of Asia. But when they went to go south into like Vietnam or subtropical China or even into the humid parts of Europe, the bows would fail
Mm.
and they weren't able to keep the supply going because it took so long to make. Um, Another thing that really helped the Mongols was just sheer determination. There was a story where the Mongols were sieging a city in southern Russia and they retreated, and the garrison, hoping to permanently drive the Mongols from their land, pursued them 130 miles from the city. And in the dead of night, the Mongols changed course and headed back towards the city.
Mm.
And they got there in less than 2 days.
Wow.
They were able to circle back an entire army 130 miles in less than 48 hours.
That's crazy.
It's insane how fast they were able to go.
Yeah.
Um, but I guess I'll add with the composite bow, it was a specific weapon made for a very specific reason. It was made for speed. It was
Mm.
made for lightning fast operations, medieval blitzkrieg, basically.
Right. That's a
Um,
great way to say it, is medieval blitzkrieg.
and yeah, that was their whole tactic. But it was not made to shoot armor piercing arrows. And so um, that is that is what they struggled with the most is empires like the Mamluks,
Mm.
um, and the Polish-Hungarian kingdoms, is because their troops were all heavy infantry, heavy ironclad cavalry,
Right.
and they were also some of the first hyper-disciplined armies that they came across.
Gotcha.
And so, like you said with the Romans, they didn't fall for the feigned retreats. They didn't fall for the typical tactics. And it kind of seemed like they didn't quite know how to counter their own counter.
Mm.
If that makes sense.
Right.
But up until that point, they were completely devastating. There was a Rus account of trying to describe the Mongols as trying to fight smoke in the wind, just
So,
constantly moving,
yeah.
just out of reach, because their army makeup was divided into decimals.
Okay.
So little pockets of 10, 10, 100, 1,000. And each pocket had their own leader that could give out individual orders, but was still subject, English is hard,
Yeah.
but still had to follow the orders of his superior. So they
Mm.
were able to move as a large group and as individual groups as well.
Right.
And so they were able to move like a living organism. It was chaos to the enemy eye.
Hmm.
They had no idea what was going. They didn't move together in a solid formation.
Right.
Um, and then one of their favorite tactics was called the Parthian retreat, where because of one of their other bit major technological advances, the stirrup, they were
Right.
able to stand, get super stable, and fire from horseback extremely accurately, even on a retreat.
Hmm.
So, um, yeah, I guess quick hitting, that's kind of the main points for the Mongolian Empire.
Right.
Um,
Right.
so, it's basically which one would win. Long, long-term fortifications and discipline, or lightning fast, quick hitting,
Right.
knock you out before you know what's going on.
Right. Yes. And like you said in the intro, like they couldn't be more different. which to me is what makes it so much fun to talk about. You know, one thing though with the Mongols, do you want to add just their connection again? What made them so? I mean, they did this like the Mongols. Every single warrior was a professional warrior simply because they lived their life that way.
Yeah, it's a hard life on the steppes of Mongolia, and so it was. You got to be tough and determined and loyal, or you were dead. It's just no two ways about it.
Right.
And so, yeah, they were so good at these, not because of their professional training necessarily, but just because it was their lifestyle.
Right.
And so, because of that, they didn't have to rely on a supply line. They didn't have to wait for the extra supplies to come because they would just hunt and they would drink the horse's milk. Um, and each warrior was assigned 5 horses as they moved across. And part of it was because when one horse would get tired, they could just jump mid gallop onto the next horse and keep going.
Right.
And then it provided milk, and if it died, well, there's a lot of protein that
Right.
you could have.
Yeah, I actually did do a little research. The Mongolians, I mean, there is evidence that they would, I mean, consume the horses, you know. And that's one thing we talked a little about before this is, again, if you're a Mongolian warrior, as long as your horse is fed and can move you, you're not expending a buttload of calories moving across. You aren't. I mean, it's like driving. Think how many calories I burn driving. As long as my car's got fuel and it can hit the road, I can eat some chips. You know, I can grab a quick snack and I'll be good for a couple hours, easy. You know, but with the Roman legions, when you have these dudes marching on foot carrying 60 pounds, and it's impressive in their speed, they need a whole supply line. They need cooks. They need slaves. In fact, kind of with the Romans is they were broken up actually because everyone thinks of the centurion, right? The group of 80, and then you have a couple like I think it's 4 of those, which or no 6 of those of the centurions or this that makes up the cohort, which then you have a bunch of those, which makes up the legion. But the Romans were actually broken down even smaller, not necessarily on a tactical level, but just an organizational level. They actually were broken down even to 8 men in a tent, but it was like 8 men. They needed 2 slaves and like 2 mules. That's a lot to deal with, and to march all of that across the empire. Again, pretty dang fast, but again, nothing compared to the speed of the Mongols. And
Yeah.
again, if you are powered, the Mongols were powered by photosynthesis in the sun. You have that with your horses are fed, you're moving, and you don't need a bunch of calories to fight when you're standing and shooting arrows versus tucked in your testito, carrying your armor with your shield. That burns a lot of calories. And so to me, that's a very real world thing that people don't really think about with these matchups and why the Mongolians were so effective in Genghis Khan. So
Yeah. I
yeah,
mean, just to illustrate how fast the Mongols were able to move, Genghis Khan himself conquered 11 million square miles in 25 years.
geez Louise.
He did
Right.
that personally. 11 million square miles in 25 years. I don't know if we can conceptualize
No.
how big that is. It's 20% of the entire landmass on Earth,
Right.
over the entire globe. 20% of it was under one man's control, and he conquered it all in his own lifetime. It's not like he
Jeez.
inherited it, he
Right.
conquered it all.
Right.
That's the speed at which they could move.
Right. Yeah, and that cannot be understated, especially if we are going to talk about this hypothetical matchup. So let's jump into it. So we drop Genghis Khan with his horde. Which how big did you find? Like how many troops he was? Again, we're just taking mainly the cavalry. You know, how many troops he would have had?
So, actually, not nearly as many as you would think,
Okay,
just because they were so deadly effective.
gotcha.
Um, And they also used psychological warfare beforehand that played into their
Mm.
success. Um, but at its height, they had like 150,000 warriors,
Okay.
which, I mean, you say the number and it sounds like a lot, and it
Right.
is. That is a lot of people. But to control an empire that large and to
Yeah.
overcome the armies that they did is not that many at all,
Right.
especially
Right.
considering they never congregated as one massive army.
Hmm.
A typical Mongolian army was between 10 and
Hmm.
30,000 troops.
Okay. Okay. I'm looking up real fast how many legions. So at a height with our hypothetical, there's about 30 legions in the empire. And then I'm going to do some, how many troops per legion. Again, I just can't remember these numbers off the top of my head. And so each legion would have had about 6,000 troops at full strength. Now, again, not I'm going to guess not every legion was fully staffed, but we'll say 5,000. So 5,000 times 30, that's going to be about 150,000 legion, like just the legions that Rome can call on, not including the auxiliary troops from the empire. So, kind of with those numbers, which actually is less than yeah. I remember even with my research, kind of being I thought there was more, but so we're dealing with similar amount. Again, Rome in this, if we want to be historically accurate, Rome can obviously call on its auxiliaries because it's in a very established empire. And in our matchup, Genghis Khan, let's just say he appears. It's 120 Common Era or AD, whatever you want to say, and Genghis Khan heads west, and the Parthian Empire is not there; it's never existed. Maybe there's some other tribes or whatever that he conquers along the way or subjugates. Well, next thing you know, he's knocking at Rome's door. Carl, what do you think? Give me your take on maybe what you think could happen in some of these first encounters in this hypothetical historical event. What do you think would kind of how it would play out?
Well, I think of something that's so interesting about this one is their fighting styles are so different, like we've
Hmm.
already stated, and they've shown weaknesses against the opposition's fighting style, but
Right.
also strengths.
Hmm.
Such as, I mean, the Romans were basically the ancient version of the Mamluk Sultanate and the Polish that eventually stopped the advance of the Mongolian horde. But the Mongols were also kind of the medieval version of the Parthians,
Right.
which stopped the advance of the Romans.
Right.
Um, what I think would happen is initially the Mongols would see a fair amount of initial success,
Hmm.
just learning how to handle it. They come in out of nowhere and they're split into multiple fighting forces and multi-pronged attacks. Um, but eventually, I believe that the Romans would do what both the Mamluks and the Polish did. They would bolster their existing defenses, um, build up the fortifications, and
Hmm.
expand and better train the garrisons. And that would really hinder the advancements.
Hmm.
Um, and they would no longer take the Mongols fight on the Mongols' terms.
Right.
They would no longer engage them in an open field where the Mongols could have a heyday. I mean,
Yeah.
if honestly, if they met on an open field, the Mongols will win 10 times out of 10
Right.
every day, all day to Sunday.
Yes.
It's not even a contest. However, using topography to their advantage, they could really even the odds. Um, and so, also factoring in that the Mongols don't have nearly as much heavy armor themselves,
Hmm.
And actually, something that I found very interesting is that the Mongolian, in the Mongolian culture, honor is viewed a little differently in a fighting sense. Because, like, when we think of that in China, in Japan, it is like
Hmm.
fight to the death, and death
Right.
is honorable,
Hmm.
and that's how you bring, you know, honor. But to the Mongols, it was actually more honorable to retreat and to preserve Mongolian life.
Hmm.
And
I would have
so
never guessed that. Truly, I would have never guessed that.
I never would have guessed that either. But that would explain why kingdoms like Hungary, Poland, the Mamluks, when they started to figure the Mongols out, they kind of just left them alone
Hmm.
because it wasn't worth the loss of Mongolian life and the loss of honor in continually wasting
Right.
manpower trying to conquer them. And so I think it would have ended in a stalemate because the Mongols would have stayed where they had their strengths and they wouldn't have advanced anymore because it wasn't worth their
Right.
trouble. And the Romans would have kind of figured out, like, we can't pursue these guys. The best thing we can do is kind of just hope they stay in their area. But
Right.
that's my personal take.
Yeah, I agree. I will say I absolutely think, the Mongolians, they're not rushing into the Roman Empire, and the Romans will stop the Mongols eventually. That's just Rome was. I mean, one, it's an established empire, so it has so much manpower to draw on. You know, but I do agree the Mongols would have some initial success. I totally see a situation like the Battle of Carhae against the Parthians, where the Mongols show up, the Romans march out the legions, a couple of them get decimated, and Rome very quickly learns we got to figure out how to fight these guys. Now, can they do it fast enough? That is the question. Can they get the fortifications up fast enough? Which, even if you read Julius Caesar, I think in his Conquest of Gaul, he does discuss how quickly they could get these fortifications up. So that to me is going to be a huge factor at the Romans is if I'm in charge and I'm realizing who these Mongols are and they've got this super swift cavalry, it's like we need to get as much manpower out there to get these fortifications to start building our artillery that can kind of counter this. But yes, again, this is maybe in some ways just kind of an anticlimactic thing. Oh, the Romans versus the Mongols, and then when you really dig into it, you realize, oh, wait a minute, like, yeah, the Mongols aren't. They're not just going to keep running into fortifications and cities and walls. And again, later in the empire, yes, they build trebuchets, they get gunpowder. They're like having these Chinese engineers build these incredible machines. But with Genghis Khan and these kind of initial hordes that are just rushing across the known world, again, I don't think they're super effective at sieging. And so I do believe the Romans, with their ability to build those fortifications, could actually, I think, stop the Mongols fairly quickly. And again, what does Rome do best? Steal. I totally imagine a scenario where after a battle, the Romans, even if they're retreating or something, they don't have to win the battle. They get a hold of the stirrup, and next thing you know, Rome is mass producing as much as it can stirrups for its soldiers. I mean, they built a Carthage ship during the Punic Wars and beat Carthage at its own game. So I do think there could be a scenario where Rome, just because it is so adaptable and they have engineers already there, that they could maybe adapt like a Mongol fighting, and maybe they do start to take on the Mongols in the open terrain. But again, I think the speed of the Mongols would just make that so. I mean, your number one goal if you're the Romans is to get up fortifications and to get your archers there. And again, your legions and your infantry are not going to have the effect that you want.
Yeah,
And so, if you're the Romans, can you kind of swallow your pride a little bit and re-engineer your army? And I think they have, even in 117, 118, 119 AD. I believe they could. I believe they absolutely could.
that was the question I was going to ask is how much do you think Roman pride would play
Right.
into this? Because there was a lot of instances where Rome could have solved something, but in their own stubborn headedness and thinking,
Right.
well, we're Rome, we're favored by the gods,
Right.
we're gods on the earth.
Right.
They just didn't. And
Yes.
so, how much do you think that would have played a factor, if at all?
Well, you see that when you look at Hannibal, my fave. He's like my favorite general of all time. He is, but that is during the Republican period where these consuls who are in charge of the army, they're just making the most boneheaded, prideful decisions even possible, and Hannibal is just whooping their tails all across the Italian peninsula. I think by the imperial period with the professional army, where troops are being trained for months at a time, I absolutely think Rome can swallow some of that pride because again, like their helmet comes from Gaul. They realized, oh, like these guys make great helmets. Let's take them. The gladius comes from Spain. They're like, wow, this is a very effective sword. Let's do it. So again, and during the Punic Wars, they do steal a Carthage ship, or they find a Carthage ship, re-engineer it for their own. So yes, I do think Rome could, but I do think they would suffer some serious losses. And it would be a crisis. I think they'd have to move a bunch of legions over. I don't think, and I don't know how many legions they would have posted in Ukraine area or Syria or wherever Genghis Khan is showing up. But I do believe that they would eventually be able to just hold the Mongols off 100%. Again, I've read things that people say like the Romans stand no chance. No, I mean, they were so far ahead of their time with so much. Now, again, an X factor for the Mongols is can they disrupt? Can they get around the Romans fortifications and disrupt the supply lines? Even
Hmm.
if they're not conquering, can they disrupt the supply lines enough that it weakens Rome? I do believe they could do that, which could cause a serious problem for Rome. But the further west you go into the Roman Empire, what do you start running into? Trees.
Mountains.
Yeah, that's not going to be the Mongols. They're not going to do well fighting in any sort of forest at all, because the second they get off their horse, they're done. Like the Roman legions will mop them up 100%.
Yeah,
So
they were capable on foot, but they definitely did not prefer it.
right, they're not going to go head on against a Testito. They're not. I mean, the Roman pilums or pilums or however you pronounce it. I mean, those are going to devastate the Mongols if they even get within range. So so yeah, again, I think this is a fun discussion to have. I love comparing but I think at the end of the day, I think Rome. I think they both decide kind of like what happened with Rome and Parthia. They just kind of decided these are the borders, and for the most part, they would have skirmishes and a couple battles, and I think is one official like Roman Parthian war, but for the most part, they just kind of live side by side, and I think that's exactly how it would go with the Romans and the Mongols, and actually, and who even knows, maybe next thing you know, like the Romans are recruiting like, hey, come fight for Rome. We'll give you money. We'll give come check us out, and the Mongols are like, yeah, sure. Next thing you know, the Mongols of their auxiliary troops are the freaking Roman auxiliary troops are like Mongol warriors.
Actually, I have found that that's what the Mamluk Sultanate did.
Oh, really?
Um, After they initially drove out the Mongols from the Syrian area and that they were kind of stalemating, um, they brought in some Mongolians that had been betrayed by a different Mongolian commander,
Hmm.
and they made the Mongolians part of their auxiliary force.
Gotcha.
And
Yeah,
so
yeah. I
he
picture
was like,
Rome
you
doing
know
that.
what? They were super good warriors. Why not have them fight for me?
Right. Right. Like you said,
Um,
they've got a sniper rifle for a weapon.
yeah, I do. I think something else that would help Rome is that the Mongolians, they didn't pass down supreme leadership by lineage
Mm.
until Genghis Khan.
Sorry, I don't
What
understand.
what they did was, if their great Khan was killed or died, he would have all the tribes had to be represented, and then a new Khan would be voted upon by the
Mm.
other tribes. And so it could have been anybody. Now, after Genghis Khan, I think kind of out of respect, and they felt like it was their obligation, they just kind of continually voted in
Gotcha.
Genghis's sons.
Yeah.
But it would have taken a long time for the horde to get together and to consult with each other and to pick a new leader to then start advancements again.
Right.
And in that time, it would have given Rome the opportunity to lick its wounds, rebuild its cities,
Yeah.
retrain more warriors, and kind of figure themselves out. So I think that would have played into Rome's hands.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good point. And actually bringing that up, it reminded me one thing that the Mongols may have kind of going for them is the fact that there are plenty is with every really like successful Roman general or centurion, because the centurions could be promoted based off of a performance. There's just an equally just awful leader, because Rome, the politics was so corrupt. If you all you needed was influence and money, and next thing you know, you're in charge of a legion, or a cohort or whatever. So I do think it could again the Roman legion could definitely it's going to be as good as its leadership. And so yeah, that could definitely work in the Mongols' favor, because I think the Mongols, it was all promotion was based off of skill. And that is such a
Yeah.
big deal that again today we take for granted. Like when I was in the army, to get promoted to a sergeant, to any sort of leadership, you had to go through school, you had to be selected. There's plenty of bad leadership in the army, but what makes the United States Army so effective is its non-commissioned officer corps, and that is so based off of ability.
Yeah.
In the Mongols, you have that. In the Romans,
Yeah.
you don't have that as
Exactly.
much.
Yeah. It caused all of the leaders to all of their commanders had to be on their A game because demotions came quickly and pretty mercilessly. They weren't killed or anything like that, but if you messed up or if you didn't perform as good as the Khan thought you should have,
Hmm.
you're demoted.
Mm.
And someone else was going to take your spot. And so it forced the commanders to be on their A game because they didn't want to get demoted. And the normal troop was on their A game because they never knew when it was going to be their shot.
Okay, yeah. No, that plays a huge role, I think, with the military, and it's something that Rome really never figured out. Like even the idea of like the emperor succession, Rome in all its glory and grandeur, it could never quite master like passing down leadership. And that is something that was his ultimate demise. Is with every great emperor, there was an equally crappy one. You think of like Marcus Aurelius, right? One of the best known, most successful emperors. Well, the dude after him is his son, who's a complete train wreck. And like, why did you let him? Like, oh my goodness, you shouldn't. Like, why could Rome not figure out this? Hey, we should probably like have the next like emperors based off of like ability, not just sons or hereditary or whatever.
Although,
But
for all their faults in passing down power, they still did better than the Mongols because the Mongolian Empire lasted about 200 years.
right, yeah,
And
that's a very good point.
towards the end, it was just wrought with civil war and internal unrest and infighting. And truly, their golden era was Genghis Khan, his sons, and then his grandsons. And after that, yeah,
It
that
was poop.
kind of, yeah, it definitely paled in comparison to what Genghis was able to accomplish.
Right, right. Kind of, very similar to Alexander the Great, man. You have these charismatic leaders. They pop up in history. It's so fascinating. They just like pop up and then they're gone. And then it's like everything they work for crumbles.
Hmm.
And that is pretty wild. So, well, I think we've covered it very well. So, to all of our listeners, again, like, subscribe. It really helps us out. We love doing this, and we love that we have some people listening. So, thank you if you listen all the way through. And again, comment what you want us to talk about next. We will do. We're going to be open to comments. I think we had a comment about the 1920s on our one about the Vikings, so that is definitely going to be on our radar and on the list. I think it is about time. I think we should shift to maybe some American history. So yeah,
I agree.
thank you for listening. I'm Gabriel,
Carl?
and see you next time.